Come on, you old clunker. Nothing. Just nothing. Damn it all to hell. Is anyone out there?
There are moments in life that seem so ordinary, so insignificant, that most people would forget them before the day is over. A stranger on the side of the road. An old truck that refuses to start. A brief conversation between two people who have never met before. Nothing about it appears important. Nothing about it seems destined to change lives. Yet sometimes, the smallest decisions create consequences that no one could have imagined. Sometimes a single act of kindness becomes the reason an entire town is forced to confront the truth. And sometimes, the person standing right in front of you is not who they appear to be. On a quiet stretch of highway outside a small Missouri town, an aging pickup truck sat motionless beneath the afternoon sun. The vehicle looked like it had traveled thousands of miles. Its faded paint was chipped. Its tires were worn. The engine had finally given up. Behind the wheel sat an elderly man with tired eyes and silver hair. He had no phone signal, no nearby gas station, no family waiting for him, just miles of empty road stretching in every direction. For nearly 2 hours, vehicle after vehicle passed him by. Some drivers slowed down long enough to stare. Others never looked at all. Nobody stopped. Nobody asked if he needed help. Nobody seemed interested in the old man stranded beside the road. It was as if he had become invisible. But then a pickup truck appeared from the opposite direction. The driver noticed the stranded vehicle and immediately pulled onto the shoulder. The man behind the wheel was a mechanic named Ryan Walker. At 53 years old, Ryan was known throughout town for repairing almost anything with an engine. He wasn't wealthy. He didn't own a chain of repair shops. He wasn't the kind of man people wrote newspaper articles about. He was simply someone who believed that if another person needed help, and you had the ability to provide it, you should stop and help. Ryan climbed out of his truck, walked toward the elderly stranger, and asked a question that would eventually change both of their lives. "Looks like you've had a rough day. Mind if I take a look?" At that moment, Ryan thought he was helping a stranger. In reality, he had just stepped into a story that would soon attract lawyers, reporters, executives, and attention from far beyond the borders of his small town. What Ryan didn't know was that the elderly driver was hiding something. Something so unexpected that even years later, people would struggle to believe it. The man's name wasn't the name he had been introducing himself with during his travels. The destination he claimed to be heading toward wasn't his true destination. And inside that old truck was information connected to a fortune worth millions of dollars. But none of that was visible from the side of the road. All Ryan saw was an elderly man in need of help. And that simple fact is what makes this story so remarkable. Because had Ryan known the truth, some people would later argue that his decision to help might not have carried the same meaning. 7 days later, Ryan's phone rang. The call lasted less than 5 minutes. By the time it ended, he was sitting silently in his repair shop, staring at the floor. His wife would later say she had never seen that expression on his face before. Friends assumed something terrible had happened. Others wondered if he had gotten himself involved in trouble. But the reality was far more shocking. The elderly stranger from the highway wasn't who he claimed to be. The broken-down truck wasn't simply a broken-down truck. And Ryan's decision to refuse payment for a repair would trigger a chain of events that no one in town could have anticipated. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the story you're about to hear isn't just about a mechanic and a stranger. It's about character. It's about integrity. It's about what happens when someone chooses to do the right thing when there is absolutely nothing to gain from it. Why was the elderly man traveling alone across the country? Why was he hiding his true identity from everyone he met? And what secret was he carrying that would eventually leave an entire community stunned? The answers would not only change Ryan Walker's future, they would force everyone around him to ask a difficult question. If they had been the ones driving past that stranded truck on the side of the road that afternoon, would they have stopped? If you had driven through that town a week after Ryan Walker stopped to help the stranded stranger, you would have thought something extraordinary had happened. Satellite news vans lined the streets. Luxury vehicles appeared in parking lots that had never seen anything more expensive than a pickup truck. Reporters stood outside local businesses interviewing residents. Lawyers carrying briefcases moved in and out of buildings throughout the day. Corporate executives from cities hundreds of miles away checked into the town's only hotel. It seemed as though the entire country had suddenly become interested in a place most people had never heard of. Yet the strangest part was that nobody knew exactly why all these people had arrived. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some believed a major corporation was preparing to buy land nearby. Others claimed a political scandal was unfolding behind closed doors. A few residents became convinced that one of their neighbors had secretly won the lottery. But the truth was something nobody could have guessed. At the center of it all stood a small auto repair shop owned by a mechanic who had no idea his life was about to change forever. Ryan continued working as if nothing unusual was happening. He repaired brakes, changed oil, replaced transmissions, and greeted customers the same way he always had. Yet everywhere he went, people seemed to be talking about him. Customers whispered when they thought he wasn't listening. Local business owners asked strange questions. Even longtime friends appeared curious about things Ryan couldn't explain. The attention made him uncomfortable because he genuinely had no answers to give. The elderly stranger he had helped on the side of the road had vanished after their brief encounter. Ryan never expected to see him again. In fact, if someone had asked Ryan to describe the most important event of the previous week, helping a stranded motorist probably wouldn't have even made the list. To him, it had been an ordinary act of kindness. Something his father had taught him to do long before he ever opened his repair shop. But what Ryan didn't know was that somewhere far away, powerful people were discussing his name. Decisions were being made. Meetings were being held. Documents were being reviewed. And at the center of those conversations was one question. Who exactly was Ryan Walker? At the same time, another mystery was beginning to emerge. Who was the elderly man from the highway? The more people investigated, the less sense his story seemed to make. He had introduced himself casually during his travels, offering little information about his past. He never spoke much about where he came from. He avoided discussing family. He never explained why he was traveling alone at his age. Witnesses who had crossed paths with him described him differently. Some remembered a quiet man who seemed thoughtful and observant. Others said he asked unusual questions about local businesses, community leaders, and the character of people living in the towns he visited. Looking back, many would later realize that he appeared far more interested in understanding people than in talking about himself. But why? What was he searching for? And why had he chosen to travel through places that most travelers ignored? Then there was the truck itself. At first glance, it appeared worthless. Rust covered parts of the exterior. The paint was faded from years under the sun. The interior showed signs of age and countless miles on the road. Yet investigators would later discover details that transformed the truck into one of the biggest mysteries in the entire story. Why would an elderly man who clearly had access to better options choose to drive such a vehicle across the country? Why did he seem oddly protective of certain items inside it? And why did several people who encountered him later recall moments when he appeared more concerned about what was stored in the truck than the truck itself? Whatever was hidden, there was important enough to travel with him everywhere he went. But nobody yet understood its significance. As the days passed, another question began to trouble those trying to piece everything together. Why Ryan Walker? Out of all the people living in that town, why did fate place Ryan on that highway at that exact moment? Was it simply coincidence? Was it luck? Or was something else happening beneath the surface? The answer depended on who you asked. Some believed Ryan had simply been in the right place at the right time. Others suspected the encounter was connected to something much larger. The possibility seemed difficult to ignore. After all, countless drivers had passed the stranded truck without stopping. Yet somehow the one person who chose to help happened to be a man known throughout the community for honesty, generosity, and integrity. Was that merely chance? Or had Ryan unknowingly become part of a test whose true purpose had not yet been revealed? And while the town debated those questions, events continued accelerating behind the scenes. More reporters arrived. More executives appeared. More questions surfaced. The phone calls became more frequent. The curiosity became impossible to ignore. Then came the moment that changed everything. A single phone call connected Ryan Walker to a truth so shocking that it would eventually dominate headlines across the country. Because the elderly stranger stranded on that highway was hiding far more than a broken vehicle. He was hiding an identity capable of changing everything people thought they knew about this story. And when that identity was finally revealed, many would discover that the encounter on the side of the road had never been as simple as it seemed. To understand why this story captured national attention, you first have to understand the man at the center of it. Long before reporters arrived in town, long before corporate executives started making phone calls, long before anyone began asking questions about the elderly stranger stranded on the highway, there was simply Ryan Walker. At 53 years old, Ryan had spent most of his life in the same Missouri town where he was born and raised. It was the kind of place where people still recognized each other at grocery stores and remembered events that happened 20 years earlier. Ryan owned a small repair shop located just off the main road entering town. The sign above the building had faded from years of sunlight. The garage doors had been repaired so many times that they no longer opened smoothly. The waiting room furniture showed its age. Nothing about the business looked impressive. Yet despite its appearance, the shop had earned something far more valuable than modern equipment or expensive renovations. It had earned trust. People knew that when Ryan told them what was wrong with their vehicle, he was telling the truth. They knew he wouldn't invent repairs that weren't necessary. They knew he wouldn't take advantage of someone who didn't understand engines. In an industry where trust often felt rare, Ryan had built a reputation that money couldn't buy. That reputation hadn't come easily. Years earlier, Ryan could have expanded his business, raised prices, and focused on maximizing profits. Instead, he chose a different path. While large repair chains opened locations nearby and spent thousands on advertising campaigns, Ryan continued operating the same way he always had. He treated customers like neighbors instead of transactions. That approach earned loyalty, but it didn't always pay the bills. As the years passed, the pressure grew heavier. New competitors arrived with larger budgets and newer equipment. Customers who once visited small local businesses were increasingly attracted to national brands offering discounts and promotions. Some months were good. Others were difficult. There were times when Ryan sat alone in his office after closing and wondered how much longer he could keep everything together. The mortgage on his property still needed to be paid. Utility bills continued arriving. Equipment repairs became more frequent. Every financial setback seemed to create another problem waiting around the corner. Yet despite those challenges, Ryan refused to compromise the values that had guided him throughout his life. Friends often told him he was too honest for his own good. Sometimes they were probably right. At home, Ryan found support from his wife, Emily. They had been married for nearly 3 decades and had raised 2 children who were now building lives of their own. Emily understood the sacrifices required to keep the business operating. She had witnessed the long hours, the financial stress, and the uncertainty that came with owning a small business. There were evenings when she found Ryan reviewing invoices at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to bed. There were weekends when unexpected repairs forced him to leave family gatherings early. Yet through all of it, he remained committed to helping people whenever he could. Emily sometimes worried that he gave away too much of his time and energy. Ryan would simply smile and remind her that there were things more important than money. It was an answer that frustrated her on difficult days, but one she secretly admired. Deep down, she knew Ryan would never be the kind of man who ignored someone in need simply because helping them wasn't profitable. The people of the town knew that as well. What many didn't realize was how often Ryan quietly helped customers who couldn't afford repairs. A retired veteran whose truck needed work before a medical appointment. A single mother struggling to keep her car running so she could get to work. An elderly widow living on a fixed income who depended on her vehicle for groceries and doctor visits. Ryan rarely talked about these situations. He never posted about them online. He never called reporters. He never sought recognition. In fact, some of the people he helped never fully understood the extent of what he had done for them. They only knew that when they expected a bill they couldn't pay, Ryan somehow found a way to make the problem manageable. Over the years, those quiet acts of generosity became part of the town's unofficial history. Stories passed from neighbor to neighbor. Small moments remembered by families who never forgot the mechanic who treated them with dignity during difficult times. It wasn't something Ryan planned. It was simply who he was. The foundation for those choices had been established decades earlier by his father. Growing up, Ryan learned lessons that had little to do with engines and everything to do with character. His father believed that a person's true nature revealed itself when there was nothing to gain and nobody paying attention. One phrase in particular stayed with Ryan throughout his life. Character is what you do when nobody is watching. At the time, those words seemed simple, almost ordinary. But over the years, Ryan discovered how difficult they could be to live by. Doing the right thing when recognition is guaranteed is easy. Doing the right thing when nobody will ever know requires something deeper. That lesson became part of every major decision Ryan made. It influenced the way he treated customers. It influenced the way he raised his children. And eventually, it would influence a decision made on the side of a lonely highway. A decision that would bring national attention to a man who had spent his entire life avoiding attention whenever possible. As another challenging week began, Ryan found himself facing familiar worries. The repair shop needed equipment upgrades he couldn't yet afford. Business had been slower than expected. Several expensive bills were approaching. The future felt uncertain in ways he rarely admitted to anyone. Yet while Ryan focused on those concerns, another story was quietly unfolding beyond the town limits. Hundreds of miles away, an elderly traveler continued making his way across the country in a worn pickup truck. He carried very few belongings. He avoided drawing attention. He seemed content blending into the background wherever he went. People who crossed paths with him rarely remembered much about the encounter afterward. That was exactly how he wanted it. But on this particular day, his journey would bring him directly toward Ryan Walker's town. Neither man knew it yet. Neither had any reason to believe their paths would cross. Yet before the sun set, circumstances would place them together on a deserted highway. And what began as a routine day for a struggling mechanic would become the first chapter in a mystery that would soon captivate an entire nation. By the time the elderly traveler reached the outskirts of town, nobody had any reason to pay attention to him. He looked like countless other Americans who passed through small communities every day. His clothes were clean but worn. His truck showed the signs of years spent on the road. Nothing about his appearance suggested wealth, influence, or importance. If anything, most people who noticed him probably assumed he was retired and simply passing through on a long journey. The name he introduced himself with was Walter Reed. It was a name that sounded ordinary enough to avoid curiosity. Around 75 years old, Walter spoke softly and carried himself with a calm confidence that seemed difficult to define. He was polite to everyone he encountered. He never appeared rushed. He never demanded attention. He never tried to impress anyone. Yet despite his unremarkable appearance, there was something about him that left a lasting impression on those who crossed his path. Looking back later, several people would describe the same feeling. They couldn't explain it at the time, but there seemed to be more to Walter than met the eye. Throughout the morning, Walter made several stops around town. He visited a diner near the highway where he ordered a simple breakfast and spent more time observing than speaking. He listened carefully to conversations happening around him. He watched how employees interacted with customers. He noticed which people treated others with respect and which did not. When he did ask questions, they were unusual. Instead of asking about tourist attractions or directions, he wanted to know about the people who lived there. He asked how long certain businesses had operated. He asked which business owners were respected in the community. He asked whether neighbors still helped each other when times became difficult. The questions struck some residents as strange, though not alarming. They assumed he was simply curious. Yet what none of them understood was that Walter seemed less interested in places and far more interested in character. Again and again, his attention returned to the same subject: people. As the day continued, Walter's behavior became even more puzzling. At a local gas station, he asked an employee which business owner in town had the strongest reputation for honesty. At a grocery store, he casually asked a customer if people still trusted one another the way they once had. In another conversation, he wanted to know whether anyone in town was known for helping others without expecting something in return. The pattern was impossible to recognize at the time because nobody heard all the questions together. Each interaction seemed harmless on its own. But when later investigations pieced together the details, a picture began to emerge. Walter wasn't randomly exploring the town. He appeared to be searching for something very specific, or perhaps someone very specific. The mystery deepened further because he never explained why those questions mattered to him. Several residents also noticed the truck. The vehicle carried license plates from another state, suggesting Walter had traveled a considerable distance. Yet he never revealed where he had started his journey. Whenever someone asked about his destination, he gave vague answers and quickly changed the subject. He seemed comfortable discussing almost anything except his personal life. No stories about family. No mention of old friends. No explanation for why a man his age was driving alone across the country. That silence only became more suspicious later. At the time, most people simply respected his privacy. After all, everyone has reasons for keeping certain parts of their life to themselves. But as the mystery surrounding Walter grew, those missing details became impossible to ignore. Why would a man who seemed so comfortable speaking with strangers avoid discussing the most basic facts about himself? There was another detail that stood out. Despite the age and condition of his truck, Walter appeared unusually attached to it. He checked on it frequently. He seemed careful about where he parked it. On more than one occasion, people noticed him returning to the vehicle shortly after leaving it, almost as if he wanted to make sure everything remained exactly where he had left it. Nothing appeared valuable inside. There were no visible signs of expensive equipment or personal belongings. Yet Walter's attention toward the truck suggested it contained something important, something he wasn't willing to leave unattended for long. The observation didn't mean much at the time. Only later would people begin asking whether the truck itself was connected to the secret Walter had spent so much effort protecting. As afternoon turned toward evening, Walter finally left town and continued driving along the highway. The questions he had asked lingered in the minds of a few residents, but most quickly forgot about him. To them, he was simply another traveler passing through. Yet miles away, Ryan Walker was finishing another day at the repair shop, completely unaware that his life was moving toward a turning point. The two men had never met. Neither knew anything about the other. One was a struggling mechanic trying to keep his business alive. The other was an elderly traveler carrying secrets no one had yet uncovered. Their worlds could not have seemed more different. And yet fate was quietly pulling them together. The sun began sinking lower in the sky as Walter continued along a lonely stretch of highway outside town. Traffic became lighter. The road grew quieter. Then, without warning, the truck shuddered violently. A strange sound came from beneath the hood. Moments later, the engine lost power. Walter guided the vehicle toward the shoulder and brought it to a stop. He tried restarting it once. Then again. Nothing happened. The engine was dead. There was no phone signal. No nearby service station. No immediate help. As the minutes passed, vehicles continued driving by without stopping. Walter sat alone behind the wheel watching each passing car disappear into the distance. What he could not know was that one of those approaching vehicles carried the very person he had unknowingly been searching for all day. And within the next few hours, a simple roadside breakdown would become the event that changed everything. As the afternoon heat intensified, Walter remained alone on the side of the highway. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, surrounded by open fields and patches of woodland that offered little comfort from the rising temperature. Every few minutes, another vehicle appeared in the distance. Walter would watch as it approached, hoping the driver might slow down. But one after another, they continued past him. Some glanced briefly in his direction before disappearing over the horizon. Others never acknowledged him at all. Minutes became an hour. An hour became two. The situation was becoming increasingly difficult. There was still no phone signal, no nearby town, no service station within walking distance. Even if Walter had decided to leave the truck behind and search for help, he would have faced miles of empty road beneath the summer sun. Yet despite the circumstances, he remained remarkably calm. He never appeared angry. He never waved frantically at passing traffic. Instead, he simply waited, as though he believed someone would eventually stop, as though he was expecting something to happen. Several miles away, Ryan Walker was driving home after a long day at the repair shop. Like most evenings, his mind was occupied with concerns about the business. A delayed payment from one customer. An expensive piece of equipment that needed replacement. A growing list of expenses that seemed impossible to ignore. The future felt uncertain, and the pressure had been building for months. Yet as Ryan rounded a bend in the highway, his attention shifted immediately. There on the shoulder sat an old pickup truck with its hood partially raised. Beside it stood an elderly man looking out across the road. Ryan barely hesitated. Long before he owned a repair shop, he had been taught that when someone needs help, you stop if you can. It was a principle that had guided him throughout his life. Without giving the matter a second thought, he activated his turn signal and pulled onto the shoulder behind the stranded vehicle. Walter watched as Ryan stepped out of his truck and approached. Their first conversation lasted only seconds, but it would later become one of the most discussed moments in the entire story. Ryan introduced himself and asked whether the truck had broken down. Walter explained that the engine had suddenly lost power and refused to restart. After a brief exchange, Ryan offered to take a look. Walter accepted with visible relief. What neither man realized at that moment was how significant the encounter would eventually become. To Ryan, it was simply another repair. To Walter, it was something else entirely. Something he would remember long after the highway disappeared in his rearview mirror. The moment Ryan lifted the hood, he realized the situation was more complicated than expected. The problem wasn't a simple battery issue or a loose connection. Several systems appeared to be malfunctioning simultaneously. There were signs of fuel delivery problems. Certain electrical components weren't responding correctly. The truck had likely been struggling long before it finally stopped. Under normal circumstances, many mechanics would have recommended towing the vehicle to a repair shop. But there was no practical way to arrange that quickly given their location. Instead, Ryan began methodically working through the problem. Minutes turned into hours as he inspected wires, tested connections, and improvised solutions using the tools available in his truck. The sun gradually lowered toward the horizon while Ryan continued working. He never complained. He never mentioned the time. He never suggested giving up. He simply focused on helping a stranger get back on the road. Throughout the repair, Walter remained nearby, observing quietly. Occasionally he asked questions about Ryan's work or his repair shop. Other times he simply watched. Yet there was something unusual about the way he paid attention. It wasn't the curiosity of someone interested in engines. It felt more personal, more deliberate, as though he was studying Ryan rather than the repair itself. Later, when Ryan reflected on that afternoon, he would remember feeling that Walter listened more carefully than most people. Every answer seemed to matter. Every small detail appeared important. At the time, Ryan dismissed the feeling. He assumed the elderly traveler was simply grateful someone had stopped to help. But looking back, he would realize there was far more happening beneath the surface than he understood. Eventually, after hours of work, the truck finally roared back to life. The engine wasn't perfect, but it was running. Relief immediately crossed Walter's face. For the first time all afternoon, the possibility of continuing his journey seemed real. He thanked Ryan repeatedly and reached into his pocket. Pulling out his wallet, Walter insisted on paying for the repair. Ryan immediately declined. Walter tried again. Ryan refused once more. The discussion continued for several minutes. Walter increased the amount he offered. Ryan remained firm. To him, charging an elderly man stranded on a deserted highway simply didn't feel right. He had the ability to help, so he helped. That was the end of it as far as he was concerned. What happened next would stay with both men forever. Walter paused for a moment before asking a question that seemed unusually sincere. He looked directly at Ryan and said, "Why would you help a stranger for free?" The question caught Ryan slightly off guard. To him, the answer felt obvious. He shrugged and responded with words that reflected the values his father had taught him decades earlier. "Because someday I might be the one stranded." There was no speech, no dramatic explanation, just a simple truth. Yet the effect on Walter was immediate. His expression changed. His eyes seemed to fill with emotion. For a brief moment, he appeared unable to speak. It was as though Ryan had said something far more significant than either of them fully understood. Walter looked away and took a deep breath before regaining his composure. The reaction felt strangely personal, almost as if Ryan's answer had confirmed something Walter had been searching for. As daylight began fading, Walter prepared to leave. The truck was running again. The highway ahead was clear. The encounter appeared finished. Ryan expected nothing more than a final handshake before both men continued their separate journeys. Instead, Walter reached into his pocket and removed a small business card. He handed it to Ryan without explanation. At first glance, the card seemed incomplete. There was no company logo, no business name, no address, no title, only a single phone number printed neatly in the center. Ryan looked at it with confusion and asked what it was for. Walter smiled faintly and told him to keep it somewhere safe. Then, without offering any further explanation, he climbed back into the truck and drove away. Ryan stood on the side of the highway watching the vehicle disappear into the distance. The entire exchange felt unusual, but not unusual enough to dwell on. He slipped the card into his wallet and forgot about it almost immediately. What he didn't know was that the small piece of paper now sitting in his pocket would soon become the most important card he had ever received. And within days, that mysterious phone number would connect him to a secret so extraordinary that it would transform not only his life, but the future of everyone around him. In the days that followed, life returned to normal, or at least it appeared to. Ryan Walker went back to the routine that had defined most of his adult life. He opened the repair shop before sunrise, greeted customers throughout the day, and spent his evenings reviewing invoices and worrying about expenses. The encounter on the highway gradually faded into the background. The business card Walter had given him remained tucked inside his wallet, forgotten beneath receipts and old notes. Occasionally, Ryan would remember the elderly traveler and wonder whether he had safely reached his destination, but those thoughts never lasted long. There were simply too many immediate concerns competing for his attention. The repair shop still faced financial challenges. Equipment still needed replacing. Bills still arrived with frustrating consistency. Whatever mystery surrounded Walter Reed seemed distant and irrelevant compared to the realities of everyday life. Ryan had helped a stranded traveler, refused payment, and moved on. As far as he was concerned, the story was over. Then the phone rang. It happened late in the afternoon while Ryan was working beneath the hood of a customer's truck. The number displayed on his screen was unfamiliar. Normally, he would have ignored it and returned the call later, but something convinced him to answer. The voice on the other end sounded professional, formal, precise. The caller asked whether he was Ryan Walker. After confirming his identity, Ryan listened as the stranger requested a meeting. No explanation was provided. No details were offered. The caller simply stated that someone wished to speak with him regarding an important matter. Ryan immediately became suspicious. The entire conversation felt strange. He asked who was calling and what the meeting concerned. The answers remained vague. The caller thanked him for his time and ended the conversation before revealing anything useful. Standing inside the repair shop, Ryan stared at his phone with confusion. The entire exchange felt more like the beginning of a scam than a legitimate business conversation. Over the next 2 days, more calls arrived. Different voices, different phone numbers, the same request. Someone wanted to meet with Ryan Walker. At first, he ignored them. Then he became irritated by them. Friends suggested blocking the numbers. Emily advised caution. Neither of them could understand why multiple people seemed determined to contact a small-town mechanic. Yet the persistence continued. Every conversation carried the same tone. Polite but deliberate. Professional but secretive. It was as if everyone involved had been instructed to reveal as little information as possible. Ryan began wondering whether the calls were connected to a customer dispute he had forgotten about. Perhaps someone intended to file a lawsuit. Perhaps a business transaction had gone wrong. No explanation seemed entirely convincing, but each possibility felt more reasonable than the truth that was quietly approaching. Then something even stranger happened. Luxury vehicles began appearing around town. Residents noticed them almost immediately because they stood out against the usual traffic. Black SUVs, expensive sedans, vehicles that looked more at home in major cities than rural Missouri. Men and women dressed in tailored suits started visiting local businesses and asking questions. They weren't aggressive. They weren't rude. But they seemed interested in learning as much as possible about one person, Ryan Walker. They spoke with store owners, former customers, neighbors, anyone willing to talk. The questions were surprisingly specific. What kind of person was Ryan? Had he always lived in town? Was he trustworthy? How did he treat people? Did he have a reputation for honesty? The inquiries only fueled curiosity. Before long, speculation spread through the community. Residents who had never paid much attention to Ryan suddenly found themselves discussing him at diners, grocery stores, and church gatherings. Everyone had theories. Nobody had answers. As the days passed, the rumors became increasingly dramatic. One version claimed Ryan was secretly selling his business to a major corporation. Another suggested he had inherited money from a distant relative. Some residents became convinced he was involved in a legal dispute worth millions of dollars. Others suspected something much worse. A few people even wondered whether federal investigators were examining his finances. The uncertainty created a vacuum that rumors eagerly filled. Every new sighting of a luxury vehicle generated another theory. Every unanswered question produced another wave of speculation. Ryan found himself becoming the subject of conversations he wasn't even aware were happening. Everywhere he went, people seemed to be watching him differently. The most damaging rumor suggested that Ryan had committed fraud. Nobody knew what kind of fraud. Nobody could explain how. But the story spread anyway. Several customers quietly asked whether everything was all right. Others avoided mentioning the subject entirely while clearly wanting to know more. Ryan tried laughing it off, but privately the situation bothered him. He had spent decades building a reputation based on honesty. Watching people speculate about scandals he didn't understand was deeply frustrating. Yet there was nothing he could do. He lacked the information necessary to defend himself because he genuinely had no idea what was happening. Then, one morning, everything changed. Another phone call arrived. This time the voice sounded different. More confident. More direct. The caller informed Ryan that a private meeting had been arranged and strongly encouraged him to attend. Before ending the conversation, the caller mentioned a name Ryan had not heard since the day on the highway. Walter Reed. The moment Ryan heard those words, he felt a chill run through him. For nearly a week, Walter had been nothing more than a distant memory. Now suddenly his name seemed connected to luxury vehicles, corporate representatives, mysterious phone calls, and growing national interest. Ryan retrieved the business card from his wallet and stared at the number printed on it. For the first time, he began wondering whether helping the stranded traveler had triggered everything that followed. What Ryan didn't know was that the answers he had been searching for were finally about to arrive. Because Walter Reed was not Walter Reed. The name was false. The story was false. The identity was false. And within hours, Ryan Walker would discover that the elderly man he had helped on the side of a lonely highway was one of the most powerful and influential individuals in the entire country. The revelation would leave him speechless, and it would explain why so many important people had suddenly become interested in a mechanic from a small Missouri town. The meeting took place 3 days later in a private conference room at a luxury hotel nearly an hour from Ryan Walker's hometown. The location alone felt out of place. Ryan had never attended meetings in buildings like this. The polished marble floors, uniformed staff, and expensive surroundings seemed worlds away from the repair shop, where he spent most of his days covered in grease and engine oil. Emily had encouraged him to attend, though neither of them knew what to expect. As Ryan entered the conference room, he immediately noticed several people already waiting inside. Men and women dressed in expensive suits sat around a large table reviewing documents. Some glanced up briefly before returning their attention to folders and laptops. The atmosphere felt serious, organized, deliberate. Whatever this meeting concerned, it clearly involved people accustomed to making important decisions. Yet even then, Ryan still had no idea why he had been invited. For several minutes, the conversation remained formal and vague. Introductions were made. Questions were asked about his repair shop, his family, and his history in the community. Ryan answered politely, but found himself growing increasingly frustrated. None of it explained why he was there. Eventually, unable to contain his curiosity any longer, he interrupted and asked the question that had been occupying his mind for days. What did any of this have to do with Walter Reed? The room became noticeably quieter. Several people exchanged brief looks before one of the executives finally leaned forward. What happened next would become one of the defining moments of Ryan's life. The executive calmly explained that Walter Reed was not the man's real name. It had never been his real name. In fact, almost everything Ryan thought he knew about the elderly traveler was false. The truth was almost impossible to believe. Walter Reed was actually Benjamin Sterling, a name recognized throughout corporate America, a man whose business empire stretched across multiple industries, a billionaire entrepreneur whose companies employed tens of thousands of people across the country. For years, Benjamin Sterling had appeared on magazine covers, financial rankings, and lists of the most influential business leaders in America. His manufacturing empire had generated billions of dollars in revenue. Financial networks regularly analyzed his decisions. Investors followed his movements closely. Yet despite that public profile, Benjamin had become increasingly uncomfortable with something that wealth had changed in his life. People no longer treated him honestly. They treated him differently the moment they learned who he was. Conversations became artificial. Kindness became transactional. Every interaction seemed influenced by his reputation, his success, or his money. The richer he became, the harder it became to know who genuinely cared about people and who simply cared about opportunity. Years earlier, Benjamin decided to solve that problem in an unconventional way. He disappeared. Not permanently, not publicly, But quietly, he began traveling across the country using different names and driving ordinary vehicles. He stayed in small towns, ate in local diners, visited businesses, spoke with strangers. He intentionally removed every visible sign of wealth from his appearance. No private jets, no luxury cars, no assistants, no corporate entourage. He wanted to experience the country the way ordinary people experienced it. More importantly, he wanted to study character. He wanted to see how people behaved when they believed there was absolutely nothing to gain from being kind. What began as a personal experiment eventually became something much larger. Benjamin spent years observing people from every background imaginable. Wealthy communities, rural towns, major cities, small businesses. Everywhere he went, he searched for the same thing: authenticity. What he discovered disturbed him. According to members of his team, Benjamin encountered hundreds of situations during those travels where people had opportunities to help and chose not to. Some ignored him entirely. Others took advantage of him when they assumed he was vulnerable. A few even lied to him in hopes of making money. Mechanics charged for repairs that weren't necessary. Business owners broke promises. Strangers offered assistance only after expecting something in return. Benjamin documented many of these experiences, not because he wanted revenge, but because he wanted to understand human nature. The findings left him disappointed. Again and again, he encountered examples of people acting differently when they believed nobody important was watching. Yet occasionally he found exceptions. Individuals whose behavior remained consistent regardless of circumstances. People whose character wasn't influenced by status, money, or recognition. Those encounters became increasingly meaningful to him. Then came the day his truck broke down outside Ryan's town. For the first time, the entire sequence of events began making sense. The unusual questions Walter had asked around town, his interest in local reputations, his curiosity about honesty and integrity. He wasn't sightseeing. He was conducting another quiet investigation into character. Long before his truck stopped running, Benjamin had already heard Ryan's name mentioned more than once. Local residents spoke highly of the mechanic who treated customers fairly. Business owners described him as dependable. Community members remembered acts of kindness that Ryan himself rarely discussed. Benjamin had found the information interesting, but information alone wasn't enough. He preferred to see people for himself. Then fate intervened. The truck broke down. The opportunity presented itself, and Ryan Walker unknowingly became part of an evaluation unlike anything he could have imagined. As the executives explained these details, Ryan struggled to process what he was hearing. The elderly traveler he had spent hours helping on the side of a lonely highway wasn't merely wealthy. He was one of the most influential businessmen in the country. The realization felt surreal. Suddenly, every strange detail from that afternoon took on new meaning. Walter's questions, his observations, his emotional reaction after hearing Ryan's answer about helping strangers. None of it had been accidental. Benjamin Sterling had been searching for evidence of character, and somehow Ryan had provided exactly what he was looking for. Yet even after learning all this, Ryan still didn't understand why the story had attracted lawyers, executives, and national attention. Surely revealing Benjamin's identity couldn't explain everything. Then one of the executives delivered another revelation. Benjamin's team had spent years documenting encounters during his travels. Thousands of pages of observations, hundreds of reports, dozens of communities. And among all those records, Ryan Walker's roadside encounter had become one of the most discussed examples of genuine integrity they had ever seen. The room fell silent. Ryan didn't know what to say, but the surprises were far from over. Because while Benjamin Sterling had been impressed by Ryan's actions, admiration was only the beginning. The billionaire's interest in the mechanic extended far beyond a single repair on the side of a highway. In fact, according to the people sitting around that conference table, Benjamin had already made a decision that would soon alter Ryan's future in ways he could never have imagined. And if Ryan thought discovering Walter's true identity was shocking, what came next would be even harder to believe. Because Benjamin Sterling wasn't finished with Ryan Walker. Not even close. As overwhelming as the revelation about Benjamin Sterling had been, Ryan Walker quickly discovered that the billionaire's true intentions extended far beyond a simple expression of gratitude. The executives seated around the conference table had only begun telling the story. What came next would challenge everything Ryan believed about that afternoon on the side of the highway. One of the attorneys opened a thick folder and carefully slid several documents across the table. At first glance, the pages appeared ordinary. Dates, locations, notes, reports. But as Ryan began reading, a troubling realization emerged. The breakdown on the highway had been completely real. Benjamin's truck had genuinely failed. The fuel system problems were authentic. The electrical issues were authentic. The hours Ryan spent repairing the vehicle were genuine. Nothing about the mechanical failure had been staged. Yet despite that fact, Ryan had unknowingly become part of something much larger the moment he stopped his truck on the side of the road. Because while the breakdown itself was accidental, Benjamin's team had been quietly monitoring many aspects of his travels for years. The explanation sounded unbelievable. Benjamin's personal security team maintained discreet oversight whenever he traveled alone. They didn't interfere unless necessary. The issue had become increasingly urgent as he grew older. Boards of directors proposed candidates. Executives positioned themselves for future leadership opportunities. Investors speculated constantly about who might eventually guide the organization. Yet Benjamin remained unsatisfied. He had spent decades building companies, creating jobs, and establishing a reputation that extended far beyond profits. He didn't want those achievements entrusted solely to someone with impressive credentials or financial expertise. He wanted something more difficult to measure. He wanted trustworthiness, integrity, character, the very qualities that seemed increasingly difficult to find. Over time, his travels across America became partially motivated by that search. He wasn't simply studying people. He was searching for examples of the values he believed mattered most. Many candidates appeared promising at first. Executives with prestigious backgrounds, business leaders with impressive resumes, consultants praised by industry experts. But again and again, Benjamin discovered gaps between public image and private behavior. Some treated employees poorly when nobody important was watching. Others made ethical compromises for personal gain. A few seemed more interested in status than service. Benjamin became convinced that character could not be measured in boardrooms or financial statements alone. It revealed itself during ordinary moments, small decisions, everyday interactions, the way people behaved when there was absolutely nothing to gain. That belief eventually brought him to a lonely stretch of highway outside Ryan Walker's town. And now, after reviewing months of investigation and years of observations, Benjamin believed he had found something extraordinarily rare. Ryan sat silently as the implications began sinking in. This was no longer about repairing a truck. It was no longer about refusing payment. It was no longer even about Benjamin's hidden identity. Something much bigger was unfolding. Something that explained why executives, attorneys, and reporters had suddenly become interested in a mechanic from a small Missouri town. Then the room grew quiet. Several executives exchanged glances. One of them smiled. Another closed a folder and folded his hands on the table. It became obvious that they had been building toward a final revelation. The investigation was complete. The reports had been reviewed. Benjamin Sterling had reached a decision. And according to everyone in that room, the announcement he was about to make would surprise not only Ryan Walker, but eventually the entire country. Because Benjamin wasn't preparing to reward Ryan. He was preparing to change his life. And when the announcement finally became public, it would trigger headlines, television interviews, and reactions nobody could have predicted. The question was no longer whether Benjamin Sterling trusted Ryan Walker. The question was what he intended to do about it. And the answer would leave the room speechless. The announcement was scheduled for the following week, and by the time the date arrived, anticipation had reached a level nobody could have imagined. What had begun as whispers and speculation inside a small Missouri town had evolved into a national story. Financial news networks discussed Benjamin Sterling's unusual travels. Business analysts debated the purpose behind his years of secret journeys across America. Social media users shared theories about the mysterious mechanic who had somehow captured the attention of one of the country's most influential businessmen. Yet despite the growing attention, very few people knew what Benjamin was actually planning. Even Ryan Walker remained uncertain. He understood that Benjamin respected him. He understood that investigators had spent weeks examining his life and reputation. But he still could not comprehend why the situation had become so significant. The closer the press conference approached, the more surreal everything felt. It was as though he had stepped into someone else's story. The event took place at the headquarters of Sterling Industries, inside a massive auditorium normally reserved for shareholder meetings and major corporate announcements. Long before the scheduled start time, reporters filled every available seat. Television crews adjusted cameras. Journalists prepared notebooks and questions. Executives from some of the largest companies in America quietly took their places near the front of the room. Back in Missouri, residents gathered inside restaurants, homes, churches, and community centers to watch the broadcast live. The entire town seemed determined to witness whatever happened next. For many, it felt personal. Ryan wasn't a celebrity. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a corporate executive. He was their mechanic. The same man who had repaired their vehicles, sponsored local events, and quietly helped neighbors through difficult times. Whatever Benjamin Sterling intended to announce, the town wanted to hear it firsthand. As the broadcast began, Benjamin walked onto the stage to sustained applause. For the first time, millions of people across the country saw the elderly traveler without the disguise of anonymity. The worn truck was gone. The simple clothes were gone. Standing beneath the bright lights was the billionaire businessman whose name dominated headlines and financial reports. Yet those who had met him during his travels later said something remained unchanged. The calm demeanor, the thoughtful expression, the habit of carefully observing people before speaking. Benjamin thanked the audience and briefly described the journey that had brought everyone together. He spoke about the years he spent traveling America under different names. He spoke about his growing desire to understand character rather than reputation. He spoke about the disappointment he sometimes experienced when people treated others differently based on wealth or status. Then, after several minutes, he finally turned his attention toward Ryan Walker. The room became silent. Benjamin explained that countless individuals had crossed his path during his travels. Some ignored opportunities to help. Some offered assistance only when they expected something in return. Others treated him with kindness until they learned there was no personal benefit involved. Yet occasionally, he encountered people who behaved differently, people whose values remained consistent regardless of circumstances. According to Benjamin, Ryan represented one of the clearest examples he had ever seen. He described the roadside breakdown. He described the hours spent repairing the truck. He described the repeated refusal to accept payment. Then he revealed something that immediately captured the audience's attention. Ryan had no idea who he was helping. He believed he was assisting an elderly stranger who could offer nothing in return. There was no audience, no publicity, no reward, just a simple decision to help another human being. Then came the announcement. Benjamin invited Ryan onto the stage. The audience erupted into applause as Ryan slowly approached the podium. Looking visibly uncomfortable beneath the attention, he stood beside the billionaire while cameras flashed throughout the auditorium. For a moment, Benjamin simply looked at him. Then he shared a decision that left the room stunned. Benjamin explained that throughout his career he had built factories, companies, and investment portfolios worth billions of dollars. Yet the legacy he cared about most involved people, communities, opportunities, the future. He announced the creation of a major national initiative focused on character-based leadership, community development, and educational opportunities. Then he revealed that he wanted Ryan Walker involved at the highest level. Not because Ryan possessed corporate experience, not because he held advanced degrees, not because he understood high finance, but because Benjamin believed integrity was the most valuable qualification a leader could possess. The surprises continued. Benjamin announced a substantial investment into Ryan's repair business, ensuring its long-term future and expansion. He revealed plans to establish scholarship programs for students pursuing technical careers. He committed funding for community projects throughout Ryan's hometown. He promised support for programs assisting veterans, struggling families, and small business owners. Each announcement generated another wave of applause. Yet for Ryan, the financial details quickly became secondary. Standing on that stage, he wasn't thinking about investments or opportunities. His mind had drifted somewhere else entirely. Back to childhood, back to long conversations with his father, back to the lessons that had guided him through every major decision in his life. As Benjamin continued speaking, Ryan felt emotions he could no longer suppress. Tears filled his eyes. The cameras captured the moment, and within hours it would spread across news broadcasts nationwide. Some viewers assumed he was overwhelmed by the money. Others believed he was simply shocked by the attention. The truth was far more personal. Ryan wasn't crying because of wealth. He wasn't crying because of recognition. He was crying because a lesson he had carried for decades had just been validated in the most extraordinary way imaginable. Throughout difficult years, he had often wondered whether doing the right thing truly mattered. Whether honesty still had value in a world increasingly focused on success and profit. Whether kindness without reward made any difference at all. Now, standing beside Benjamin Sterling, he finally had his answer. Then came the moment that would become the defining quote of the entire story. Benjamin stepped closer to the microphone. The auditorium grew quiet. Millions watched from home. And Benjamin delivered the words that perfectly captured everything he had learned during his travels across America. The repair wasn't what impressed me. He paused. It was who you were when you thought nobody important was watching. The audience rose to its feet. For several seconds, the applause was overwhelming. And in that moment, the story ceased to be about a broken truck, a billionaire, or even a mechanic. It became something much larger. A reminder that character is often revealed during ordinary moments. That integrity rarely announces itself. And that the choices people make when nobody is paying attention may ultimately define who they truly are. Yet even as the applause continued, another realization was beginning to emerge. Because the impact of Benjamin's decision would extend far beyond that stage. The investments, scholarships, and opportunities were only the beginning. What happened afterward would transform an entire community and leave a legacy neither man could have anticipated. In the weeks following the press conference, life in Ryan Walker's hometown began changing in ways few people thought possible. For years, the community had struggled with many of the same challenges facing small towns across America. Local businesses fought to survive against larger competitors. Young people often left in search of better opportunities elsewhere. Veterans faced difficulties accessing resources. Families worked hard simply to stay ahead of rising costs. None of those problems disappeared overnight. But for the first time in a long while, people felt something they hadn't experienced in years. Momentum, hope, possibility. The attention generated by Benjamin Sterling's announcement attracted investment, visitors, and opportunities that previously seemed out of reach. Yet perhaps the most remarkable part was that Ryan never sought any of it. The man at the center of the story remained exactly who he had always been. The repair shop that had once struggled to keep pace with expenses soon found itself overwhelmed with support. Customers arrived from neighboring counties simply to meet the mechanic whose story had inspired the nation. Business owners offered partnerships. Suppliers provided discounts. New opportunities emerged almost daily. With Benjamin's investment, Ryan was finally able to purchase modern equipment, expand service capacity, and improve the facility that had served the community for decades. Additional service bays were constructed. New diagnostic technology was installed. Most importantly, new employees were hired. Young mechanics who once might have left town searching for work now found opportunities close to home. Experienced technicians joined the growing business. What had once been a modest repair shop fighting for survival evolved into a thriving operation supporting families throughout the region. Yet despite the expansion, longtime customers noticed something important. Ryan hadn't changed. He still greeted people personally. He still treated customers fairly. He still remembered names, families, and stories. The success had increased his opportunities, but it hadn't altered his character. The scholarship program Benjamin announced quickly became one of the most impactful parts of his initiative. For years, many local students interested in technical careers struggled to afford education and training. Now those barriers began disappearing. Scholarships helped aspiring mechanics, electricians, welders, engineers, and skilled tradespeople pursue opportunities that previously seemed impossible. Families who had worried about financial limitations suddenly found new doors opening for their children. Several recipients later admitted they had nearly abandoned their dreams before learning about the program. Others returned to the community after completing their education, bringing new skills and experience back home. The ripple effects extended far beyond individual students. Local businesses gained access to a stronger workforce. Economic opportunities expanded. The community began growing in ways few residents had imagined possible only a few years earlier. Benjamin also remained committed to supporting veterans, a cause that became deeply personal throughout the initiative. Ryan had always quietly assisted veterans whenever he could, often repairing vehicles for little or no profit when circumstances required it. Now those efforts expanded dramatically. New programs helped veterans access transportation, job training, and financial support during difficult periods of transition. Several former service members found employment opportunities through partnerships created as part of Benjamin's initiative. Others received assistance that allowed them to rebuild stability after years of hardship. The impact was significant enough that neighboring communities began exploring similar programs. What started as one act of kindness on the side of a highway gradually evolved into something much larger than either Ryan or Benjamin could have anticipated. As months turned into years, economists and local leaders began noticing measurable improvements throughout the region. New businesses opened. Existing businesses expanded. Employment opportunities increased. Families who once considered leaving chose to stay. Outside investors took interest in the town's future. Yet despite all the positive developments, residents rarely spoke about economic statistics or financial growth when discussing the story. Instead, they returned to the same simple truth. None of it would have happened if Ryan Walker had driven past a stranded truck that afternoon. The entire chain of events traced back to a decision that lasted only a few seconds. A choice most people would never have considered remarkable at the time. Stop or keep driving. Help or continue home. Nothing more complicated than that. Years later, Benjamin Sterling was asked during an interview what lesson he hoped people would remember from the experience. By then, the story had become widely known. Business schools discussed it. Leadership conferences referenced it. Articles and documentaries examined the events from countless angles. Yet Benjamin's answer remained remarkably simple. He explained that many people spend their lives chasing success. They pursue recognition, wealth, titles, influence, and achievements. There is nothing inherently wrong with those goals. Success can create opportunities to improve lives and build meaningful things. But according to Benjamin, success alone is not what people remember most. Success reveals character. It exposes priorities. It amplifies values that already exist. But kindness creates something different. Kindness creates legacy. It leaves an impact that continues long after achievements are forgotten. Wealth may build companies. Influence may shape industries. But character shapes lives. And perhaps that is why this story continues to resonate long after the headlines faded. Because in the end, it was never really about Benjamin Sterling's fortune. It was never really about investments, scholarships, or national attention. It wasn't even about a billionaire traveling the country under a false name. It was about a lonely highway, an aging truck, a man stranded without help, and another man who chose to stop. When we first met Walter Reed, he appeared to be an ordinary traveler sitting beside a broken vehicle under the summer sun. Cars passed him by. Time passed. Opportunity passed. Then Ryan Walker arrived. At that moment, neither man could see what the future held. Neither understood the consequences waiting just beyond the horizon. Yet one simple act set everything in motion. The expansion of businesses, the creation of scholarships, the support for veterans, the transformation of an entire community. All of it began with a decision that seemed insignificant at the time. A lonely highway, a broken truck, a simple decision to stop, and one moment that changed everything forever. As this remarkable story comes to an end, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on just how differently things could have unfolded. Ryan Walker could have kept driving that afternoon. He could have convinced himself he was too busy. He could have assumed someone else would eventually stop to help. Like every other driver who passed Walter Reed's truck that day, he could have looked in the other direction and continued home. No one would have blamed him. No one would have criticized him. In fact, most people would have forgotten the stranded truck existed within a matter of minutes. Yet Ryan made a different choice. A choice that not only changed his own future, but created opportunities for countless other people. It transformed businesses, supported families, helped veterans, and opened doors for students who may never have received those opportunities otherwise. All because one person decided that helping a stranger mattered. But stories like this are fascinating because they force us to ask difficult questions about ourselves. It's easy to admire Ryan's decision after knowing how everything turned out. It's easy to celebrate kindness when the ending is inspiring. The harder question is what we would have done in that same situation without knowing the outcome. If you had been driving down that lonely highway and seen Walter Reed standing beside his broken truck, would you have stopped? Would you have offered your time, your expertise, or your assistance without expecting anything in return? Or would you have assumed someone else would eventually help him? Let us know in the comments because there are no perfect answers. Every person sees situations like that differently, and we'd love to hear your perspective. Another question that continues to spark debate whenever people hear this story involves Benjamin Sterling himself. Do you think Benjamin was right to spend years traveling across America under different identities? Was his search for honesty and character justified? Or do you think secretly observing people crossed a line? Some believe Benjamin's approach revealed important truths about human nature. Others argue there are better ways to learn who people really are. It's a fascinating discussion because both sides raise valid points. So tell us what you think. Was Benjamin's test fair? Or would you have handled things differently if you were in his position? And perhaps the most personal question of all is this. Have you ever experienced a moment where a small act of kindness changed your life? Maybe it wasn't a billionaire in disguise. Maybe it wasn't a story that made national headlines. Perhaps it was a teacher who believed in you when nobody else did. A stranger who helped during a difficult time. A friend who showed up when you needed support most. Sometimes the moments that shape our lives don't seem important at the time. Sometimes they appear ordinary until we look back years later and realize everything changed because of them. If you've experienced something like that, share your story in the comments. Some of the most powerful stories come from real experiences, and you never know whose day you might inspire by sharing yours. And finally, put yourself in Ryan Walker's position. Imagine discovering that the elderly stranger you helped on the side of the road was actually Benjamin Sterling. Imagine learning that your actions had been observed, documented, and discussed by some of the most powerful people in the country. Imagine standing on that stage hearing Benjamin explain why he trusted you. What would you have done? Would you have accepted the opportunities he offered? Would you have reacted differently? Let us know because we genuinely love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoy emotional true-style stories, hidden identity mysteries, inspiring acts of kindness, and life-changing twists, subscribe now because we have many more powerful stories coming your way. Every week, we bring you stories that remind us how extraordinary ordinary people can be when faced with unexpected moments. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like the video and share it with someone who believes kindness still matters in today's world. And if you think Ryan Walker's story was unbelievable, wait until you hear what happened next. In our upcoming story, a homeless veteran discovers a lost wallet on a park bench and makes the simple decision to return it. What he doesn't know is that the wallet belongs to a member of one of the most powerful families in America. What follows is a journey filled with secrets, unexpected connections, shocking revelations, and a twist that nobody sees coming. Trust us, you won't want to miss that one. Until next time, remember this. You never truly know whose life you might change through a single act of kindness. And sometimes, the people who appear ordinary are carrying stories far more extraordinary than we could ever imagine.